Hey, Calvin. Good morning.
Hey, Alex, how are you doing? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. You having a good week so far?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. How about you?
Yeah, lots to do, but yes.
Hey folks, it's Benji.
Hey, Benji.
I tried signing out and signing back in again to see if I could come in as myself, but apparently not. Denied.
Hey there. Oh, Alex, so good to see you. It's been a long time. How you doing?
Been hella long. How you doing?
Yeah, doing great. Also, Matt, good to see you here. I didn't know you were coming. We thought you were not going to make it.
Hey, all.
Good to see everybody.
Even what? So I think it's just Stephen and Young Min that we are waiting for.
I'm really glad you're here, Matt. I feel like there was some stuff we needed some clarification from you or team on.
Who's leading today? Is it you, Calvin?
Yeah, I'll do it. I am just adding everyone as attendees to the notes doc.
Great, thanks.
Okay, that's done. Benji, you'll have to give me some guidance here. What do we need to do for this first thing on the agenda is agreeing to the membership agreement? Is there anything actually to be done for that, or?
Nothing to be done other than reading out that is what everyone has done.
Okay. Yes, and I agree. It's also worth stating, well, it's probably worth stating that this meeting is, bound by those. So if anyone objects, then probably shouldn't be in the meeting. Okay. Why don't we just take, I think we all know each other, but this is a refresher since it's been a while since we all met. We can probably just take 5 minutes to go around and reintroduce ourselves. I don't know if anyone sees the same order as me. I think it's probably in the order that we joined.
Do it in the order of the agenda file.
Okay. Then that means I'll be up first. So my name is Calvin. I've met many of you. Matt, I don't think we've met officially yet. But I work at Apollo on Apollo iOS, so building tooling for iOS and Swift. Yeah, that's me. Stephen, I think you're up next.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, I didn't have the agenda up yet. I'm Stephen. I work in Netflix, but I'm also in the GraphQL, TSC, and very interested in client-controlled nullability.
Hi, my name is Young, and I work at the trade desk, and I originally worked with Alex on this proposal, and I'm also getting back right now into it.
I'm Alex. I'm at Pronto AI. I was the previous champion on this proposal. Psyched to be back.
Hey, I'm Anthony. I have also been really engaged in this proposal for quite a while now. I'm at Apollo on the iOS client alongside Calvin.
I am Benoit, also from Apollo, and I work on Apollo Kotlin.
I'm Matt. I'm at Meta, work largely on the iOS and Android clients.
Hi, everyone. I'm Benji. I work at my company is Graphile, and I do quite a lot to help keep meetings like these working. I just want to note for anyone watching this back on YouTube that by attending this meeting, we have all agreed to the specification membership agreement, the participation guidelines, the contribution guide, and the code of conduct, all of which are linked from the agenda file, so anyone can have a read of those if they like. Back to you, Calvin.
All right. Okay. I started taking notes. I can continue taking notes. So I will take that. The agenda that we currently have is, I put this up as to discuss the two things that are already outstanding for CCN to move forward, or what seems like the two things that are outstanding. Is there anything, I have one more thing that I would like to maybe add to the agenda, but is there anything else that anybody would want to discuss?
Is the list syntax still in discussion?
It seems like it's come about as a talking point. I don't know how much we want to open that can of worms, but it's probably worth talking about. Benoit, do you feel that you can, it was really Martin that was raising the point of the list syntax. Do you feel that you can get his point across, or if you're in agree with him, then your point too, I suppose?
Yeah, maybe we can look at that at the end, but yeah, pretty much. There's just a thread open on the spec PR talking about that, and the question is about whether we want to have like a shortcut syntax for lists. Yeah, I'm not sure if we need to discuss more about this, or maybe keeping that on the thread.
If there's time at the end of this, let's pick it up. It's worthwhile having a discussion about it now, but yes, probably ongoing discussion in the thread is also worthwhile. The other thing that I wanted to raise is the notion of trimming back what CCN is in the spec. Trying to sidestep these discussions is something that should happen outside of CCN. I think it would lead to an easier process of getting CCN through, but we can come back to those afterwards. I do think there's valuable discussion in the two that we have here. Okay.
I think that's actually kind of related to some of the points that are going to be made about error propagation.
Right. Okay, so then from the previous meetings action items.
Do you want me to lead through this, Calvin?
Yes, please.
Sure. Okay, so there were 3 action items from last week. It was last week. I'm going to look at them in order, the numeric order of the issues. The first one was assigned to me to sync the video to YouTube. That has been done, so I shall close that issue. The second one was again for me, was to write up my concerns regarding the try-catch method proposed for client control nullability, which I have done. You can read those notes in that issue number 2. I should probably put them somewhere else, but we can discuss that later as part of this topic, perhaps. I'm going to go ahead and close that since writing it up has been done. And there was a third action item, which was to set the date of this meeting. Calvin, do you feel you've completed that?
Yes, we have.
Excellent, we have, because we're all here. So we'll go ahead and close that as well. Okay, that's all the action items. Well done, everyone.
Amazing. All right, well then it's on to the meat of this, which is really the 2 discussion points. We can go through them in the order that they are, which is with error handling first. Who wants to take up that discussion or have their say as first up?
Does Benji want to go first since you wrote up the thing?
Well, that has to do with the nullability assertions. If we're specifically talking about the error handling
Oh,
questions,
yeah, okay.
that's yeah. I will just start here since nobody's saying anything yet and say that I think that there is room for other options here to be considered. And there was some really interesting talk about exposing errors in line that really appealed to me, particularly because of some of the things regarding the assertions and some of the, at least what I gleaned to be the concerns of the relay team. So I'd love to talk about that as well, but particularly around finding ways to expose field errors when you are going to have partial data and it's not a completely fatal error. I'm not opposed to exposing them in either the errors or some handled errors specific, special key at the root, but being able to do those in line would allow for individual components that need to make determinations around how they handle errors and display or don't display information based on errors at the component level, it a lot easier to do. And I think that might be a really valuable tool for perhaps addressing some of the concerns on both the error handling and the null assertions.
My concern with that kind of change is that it's too large that has the potential to block this proposal from moving forward. And I think that has been the struggle with this proposal. We originally started with a simple notion that, oh, this will just change the nullability check. And then it has blown up to, oh, how do we deal with the errors? And I think that's why I think after almost like 2 years that we haven't seen a real progress on this proposal. And I'm really biased towards, if this is not a one-way door decision, can we postpone and get it to like the stage 2 and see what the community says, and then introduce the change, because we are not bound by it. Yeah, at this point.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that.
Whilst I agree with that broadly, I would say that it's an interesting time to potentially introduce that kind of change, because we are making a syntactic change where clients are opting in, and we may not get that kind of opportunity if we want a change like that to be added at a later time, to then have to add yet another piece of syntax that would opt in. So if this is something that we feel that would benefit GraphQL, and I am personally not convinced that it is, but if it were, now would be an excellent time to introduce it.
Yeah, thanks for that, Benji. I think that, as Kelvin, I think, was alluding to before he wanted to talk about, we should be very aware of all of these things, and we should talk about them on a general, broad level as possibilities and opportunities. And if any of them feel like they gain traction or excitement, try to find a way to separate those out from the CCN specification. I hope we don't have to do this all together at the same time. But I also think that having ideas for future iterations and future features that could address some of the concerns and problems that people are having allows us to maybe move faster on CCN and say, we're going to address that. That's out of scope for this, but that's something we can iterate on and address. And if we account for that in the first place, we can build CCN in a way that gives people confidence that we can then later address those things.
Yeah, that's really what I was trying to get to with the other agenda item. Is it's exactly that. I share Young's feeling that these two discussions are dragging on CCN getting into the spec. I've always only ever considered CCN in the scope of Benji, what you described as the simple nullability, where it simply changes the type of the field, basically. And while I think these things are valuable, they certainly are, I think they affect GraphQL as a whole, the spec. And if we solve them within the case of CCN, and we run the risk of just thinking about them in the context of CCN, when I think CCN is just one part of the spec, and if these things change outside as a result of another RFC or another proposal, CCN would just come along for the ride because it has to adhere to whatever the change is.
Yeah. Yeah, a great example of that is like using this, question mark operator as a catch for partial errors. CCN errors are not the only possible types of partial errors or field errors that could exist in the future. And so tying the syntax for catching any sort of partial or field errors in the future to CCN syntax seems short-sighted.
Matt, do you want to talk about, it sounded like at the last working group meeting, you had discussed this a little bit, and Relay had said that, or you'd said that Relay would be basically fine if errors were handled as they're being handled, like, right, status quo GraphQL.
Yeah, I can't remember what I actually said at the working group meeting. So one of the worries with client controlled nullability is that Relay is basically going to not use it at all. It'll just, like, the way Relay handles it is essentially creating, in essence, a result type at the fragment or component boundary. Or like either it just bubbles a null, or it bubble, like, right, because we have at required, which is either like you either bubble the null to the nearest parent that can be null, or you throw an error and the responsibility is at the component level, basically, to handle that error. For like existing errors, I'm not 100% sure how Relay handles it. I did come across a proposal today by Jordan to add an at result type, which would allow basically field accessors to be transformed from just like get or null to like get a result of whether this is an error or basically an okay of possibly null, or a value, or a like error. And that that feels like, if you want field level error handling, there needs to be some mechanism for that. But if that's just in the errors array, that's probably fine. You just need like the client to know, when I'm looking up this field, I might have to go to the errors array. But you also need to know that at the so the parent field can be null. How does client controlled nullability errors propagating from some like child level field, how does that affect the error accessing in the parent tree?
Yeah, can you say more about what you mean, the error accessing on the parent tree? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so with client controlled nullability, if we didn't have the question mark syntax, we're just to have the exclamation, right? Then when you're actually accessing a field, you might not, when you access a field that is nullable, and it is null, how do you semantically tell the client, oh, the reason it was null is because there was an error, versus it's just null because like it happened to be like, and do you basically have to carry that result type style access up to whatever parent could be transformed into null.
I think my understanding of relay was that if it gets a response that contains errors, then the entire response is not written to the cache. Is that accurate or no?
I don't know.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
From reading, so I just linked to a comment I made that sounds very similar, Matt, and that was, oh, I'm sorry, Stephen, I didn't see your hand was up. I cut you off. Go.
No,
please.
go for it, Anthony.
Sorry about that. I was just going to say that it was in response to a comment from somebody on, I believe, your team, Matt, Mofeiz. I don't know who that is.
Mofe. Yeah.
Mofe. Okay. Talking about how they wanted to be able to understand what components should be rendered, basically based on, well, was this thing null because of a null child field, or having an error, or is this actually a null object? Talking about like the author of a post is a good example, right? So was the post because of the author not existing anymore, maybe being a deleted user, or it being a sponsored ad or something that didn't have a user as an author, or was there an error within the author object? So there's a number of different ways we can handle that. And I do think that really that's something that could continue to be improved on and iterated on in the future outside of CCN being implemented. But the simple nullability concept that Benji proposed in his 3 kind of different ways of doing this seems the most conducive to allowing us to handle that. And as you said, Matt, right now you theoretically could, as long as the errors, those field errors, are in the root, response objects errors array, you could trace the operation paths back to them and find it out. That's kind of cumbersome work for the client to do. And that's where the idea of something like having the ability to fetch field errors in line with an @result type I like, or some introspection field or something, would be really valuable. But theoretically, in the meantime, this is something that we could do just with the root level errors. And I actually think that gives us time to consume and have lots of people consuming CCN and finding out what kind of struggles they're having, what problems they're having, and build that with more informed use cases.
Yeah, it's interesting how this proposal ends up touching on like these other kind of constraints in GraphQL that we're wanting to fix, like like with the errors in the errors array. This is a question that I think Otto's had for a long time. Like, how do you connect that in the errors array? And like at Netflix, coming from Falcor, where it is inline, there is no errors array. That was like a very natural. Like that was like one of our first questions coming to GraphQL. And in theory, you have the path there, and so client tooling in theory could handle this without changing the GraphQL spec or response or anything. But in practice, we don't. But then that gets me to another, I guess, kind of like constraint in GraphQL that I think Matt touched on, which is that we in GraphQL intentionally, for simplicity, conflate null versus like unavailable because of error, and that sometimes that is nice to know the distinction, and that's something that actually just came up recently. There's a developer asking on the back end about the bang in GraphQL, and he wants to know how to communicate to his clients that these fields should never be null, but I'm not going to put a bang on them because GraphQL reasons. This field actually is sometimes null, and that's valid. This is a genuinely nullable field. There's not a good way to communicate that besides like doc strings right now. And so I actually would be interested in like maybe a follow-up RFC to this that would maybe address that problem. I hesitate to bundle it with CCN because for the reasons already stated, as minimal as we can make this change, more is it makes it more likely make progress. But maybe it is worth considering. And that is, like what about an interrogatory symbol on the SDL on the server side to indicate that intent from the server, to help communicate that. I think the only reason to bundle that potentially would be what Benji mentioned, is that it's a syntax change, and we don't do that very often in GraphQL, making syntax changes. But then stepping back for a moment, in order to make this RFC as minimal as possible, it's worth maybe revisiting, exactly what problem this is trying to solve, and then we can see, what is the minimal scope we need to include in order to accomplish that.
Yeah, I think that's a good approach to start from, stripped fully back to the exclamation point exists, and you can say that something should, a field should exist, and then piece by piece bringing stuff back as we decide we need it. I don't want to start from scratch, so definitely start with, like, we have loads and loads of notes, thanks to Benji and thanks to write-ups other people have done on why decisions have been made. So definitely don't start from scratch, but yeah, I don't know. Anthony?
Yeah, I definitely agree with stripping a lot of this back. I do feel like the existence of the question mark operator makes intuitive sense and does provide on its own, without any more additional behavior, a level of value there. Because if you have a field that you have put the bang operator on and it is null, if the basic way of handling that is just we propagate up to the next null field, null parent, then there may be a situation in which you want to make the parent null. You want to decide what that parent that you're making null is. And that doesn't require any additional error boundary handling. It doesn't require anything with fragment boundaries. It doesn't require catching of errors or anything else. It just is a natural way to apply the same concept of we're just deciding on the client side what is and isn't nullable. And because null errors propagate up to the next null object, you can decide what that null object is. It is very, very intuitive. It's, I think, easy to teach. It's easy to understand and learn. And it provides behavior that is expected for users in all cases. But I also think that all of these other conversations are super valuable to be having. I personally think that trying to use the question mark operator as a error catching syntax is really unintuitive and confusing to me. And it makes it do a lot more things than what you would think it does at first, which can cause a lot of people to accidentally break things for themselves. I would prefer error catching and handling to be done with something more explicit, either another operator completely or an @catch directive or some other type of syntax that makes it very clear that this isn't about making a field that was required optional now, so that as a side effect, we get this propagation of nullability, but that we want to take an error and do something with it. And I don't think the question mark operator is an appropriate or clear way of doing that. So even if we all were aligned on what the right behavior for error handling is, I don't think that using the question mark to do that is the right thing to do. And I think that that allows us to unlock moving forward with CCN and accept that we can continue to have these conversations and do something with error handling much more explicitly.
So just to summarize what I'm hearing is include bang and question mark, but with kind of the simplest defined behavior.
That's definitely what I support. Yeah.
Yeah,
Cool.
there is the question of what is the simplest defined behavior, and is the simplest defined behavior actually bubble to the nearest question mark or just bubble to the nearest nullable parent? Because those are two very different things. And like when you do null bubbling on the server, you are bubbling to the nearest null parent, because that's like the definition of question mark versus required in at the schema level. But if you're doing client controlled nullability, if you're saying this thing can never be null, should you also be saying, and this is the boundary at which it's okay for it to be null, if you only bubble up to the nearest nullable parent, that is not what you're saying. Right? If all fields in your schema are nullable, which is roughly the case with meta, if every single field is nullable and you put a bang on like the name field of user, you might be able, or like best friend. So you've got user, best friend, name, you put the bang, you might be saying, oh, I want to handle that at the best friend level and I want best friend to be null. Or you might be saying, I cannot handle name on best friend being null. So I don't even want to, like, and that is different to me than best friend being null, right? Because those are two very different things. If all we do, like if I put a bang on user, or if I put a question mark on user, it does nothing, right? Anytime you have a question mark above purely or on a purely nullable field, it's a no-op. If we do purely null bubbling. No, you're muted, Anthony.
Sorry, but the handling of that error is a client-side defined behavior that I think is not easily expressible through this syntax. We've been struggling to find a way, you know, Benji's explanation of, I think, the 3 different options that he put out, it really, to me, almost like closed the book on this discussion because of the inconsistencies that the try catch concept brings. I think that if that's what we want to do, we should introduce an at catch directive or some other way of handling that. Everything you're describing you want to do can be done through parsing the errors and figuring out where that field error was, and then exposing some custom behavior on your client. Is that not?
No, I'm arguing that the question mark basically, if we have bubbling, basically if we bubble to the nearest nullable field always, and a question mark just indicates, hey, if this field is null, that's fine. It'll be confusing for a few reasons, one of which is that the schema can always take a non-nullable field and make it nullable. That is not a backwards incompatible change or a forwards incompatible change. Or rather vice versa. We can take a nullable field and make it non-nullable.
Right.
And like, okay, if I make that change, suddenly, like
that does change behavior on clients in the wild already. Yeah, I see that.
Yeah, there's the other thing of just like question mark in general, like if I'm writing out my query and I put a question mark 2 levels above my client control, my bang, it's unclear to me that that does not mean everything below this question mark should be empty or should be nullified if any of my required fields are not available or null or errors, whatever it is.
Yeah, to me, that syntax is very not, it's not, maybe we're saying the same thing, I'm not sure. It's not clear to me that putting an exclamation point at, you know, best friend name and then putting a question mark on the user two parents up would make that an error boundary for this exclamation point. That is not at all clear. If you wanted that, I would suggest you have a try and a catch directive that are much more explicitly like, okay, I want this thing to be non-null, and here's a try to say that if it doesn't, I want to catch it here. And those tries and catches may be multiple different errors layered in different areas, so you're going to need to put like label parameters on those. so you can, match them up and things. But just having an exclamation point and a question mark, it doesn't at all seem intuitive to me that that's what that's doing.
I completely agree. And I also think that when you're writing components, or when you're writing fragments, sorry, for your components, people are going to want to be able to say like, oh, I don't want to render this if there is no avatar URL. So they put the bang on it. They're not the ones who are adding the question mark somewhere else. Most likely that's someone who's rendering that component. That's their concern. And so making everything in between non-nullable just feels not very GraphQL-y. It's not very like fragment centric.
And you're certainly not making them non-nullable. You're only making them non-nullable in the case of a field error. If they're naturally null, they're still just null.
Yeah, and the reason that bang propagating to question mark is like the currently accepted thing is because we were trying to replicate Relay's fragment propagation boundaries, and maybe the solution there is to use the stripped back thing for now, and then I believe I haven't been keeping up, but I think fragment isolation is still in the works, and maybe that sort of does a better job of replicating Relay's fragment propagation boundaries than bang to question mark propagation does.
Yeah.
Yeah, and further, keeping the behavior of propagation to basically matching the bubble up that occurs right now with GraphQL might make it more amenable to like future changes, like to being able to work with future changes in the GraphQL spec that work around like fragment boundaries or something. So that would be really cool to see in the GraphQL spec, something that does something with finger boundaries.
Yeah, I guess with the worry I think keep circling on the Relay side, if I'm gonna put words in their mouth, but whatever, is basically if I have a field with a bang, how do I know whether, if at the component level I want that to mean like, if this, like, I need that field, if I need that field in order to render my component. If that is what it means, then how do I know the difference between the parent field is actually null and this field that has the bang was null and like can't be handled? And if the answer is we cannot know that difference, then any client that wants to do component level nullability handling cannot. It becomes impossible. So Relay will never use client controlled nullability, which it feels like something is askew if that's the case.
But isn't the answer to that parsing the errors? Is that not viable?
No, because once we hit the field that is null, I mean, sure, if we're going to, if any time a client controlled nullable field is null, we put that into the errors array, yes, that is an option. On the other hand, we may not even hit that component because the parent, if it's the top level field in a fragment, then the parent component is the one that's going to have a null field. And that parent component could be like, yeah, it's fine. I'm not even going to attempt to render this like child field. Like Relay basically is a lazy renderer, so it doesn't even attempt to read out that empty field. So at the very least, any top level fragment fields could never be client controlled nullable. And even for fields underneath, yes, we could use an errors array. You could ask, are there any fields within this fragment that that should throw? But even that is potentially difficult to tell for
Sure.
various reasons.
Would it be fair to say, Matt, that Relay would not be able to use CCN until either fragment isolation or some try catch directive or other syntax is added to it?
Relay would not be able to use CCN even with fragment isolation under the current bubbling proposal.
The current one,
The
Bang to
non-bubbling,
Simple nullability.
oh,
under
okay.
the, like, we only add bang, and question mark means like bang only means bubble up until you hit something that happens to be nullable or a question mark.
What if what if CCN was just relays directives?
Unfortunately, relays directives, you oh yeah. If CCN was basically at required throw, which is
Or like
what,
all of the options, like
yeah, okay, yeah. If that's what it was, then it would be handleable, I think. Yeah. There are some instances where Relay would have to compile it away until we had fragment isolation, but not once we have fragment isolation.
got it.
Now, if Relay were to, not do any special handling for CCN, but also were to not like remove it from the query and just pass it onto the server, I mean, I guess it would be basically the same behavior as if the server had marked it as non-null. Would that be okay?
No,
Basically,
because
just to allow
it is mildly different in that it's not considered. So if we consider it an error, then maybe the key trick about client controlled nullability is that it's currently infectious across fragments. Which, let me think. Yes, I guess maybe you're right. You might be right.
As written, the CCN the CCN operators have to agree across fragments, otherwise it's a validation error. Which I think is a problem for the way that like Relay could handle it, and they could just throw errors if just say that this isn't a valid fragment or whatever, because it doesn't match up with the other fragments. But I think what you're saying is like as written, or as people use Relay, it would be a huge problem.
Yeah, so the problem, even with them having to match, the problem is I can have like a short name bang that is only in my one component way over here, that like I've got one component that requires the short name. If I don't have that short name, like I don't want to even attempt to render that component, whatever. So I ask for the short name here. And then somewhere else, I'm just asking for my full name, totally different component, but it's part of the same request. And like, if the short name is not there, the whole user's nulled out.
And I believe the way that this is currently written, correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, is that if you wanted short name, only in one place, like basically you would have to alias it and call one of them short name not null. Otherwise, the query just won't validate if you only do it in one. That's basically what we had, the way we have it. Is that right?
Well, you were saying short name only exists in one fragment, and then but then when they would get merged, then it would propagate and blow out everything else.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah. I see. If it doesn't exist in the other fragment.
Yeah. So in that case, there's
But
no
wouldn't fragment isolation solve that?
Correct. Or yes, you need fragment isolation to solve that. The question is, even when you have fragment isolation, like it's not. Yeah.
Okay, maybe this is something that I realized I have not said yet to anyone, but it's been in my head this whole time. My concept there is that with fragment isolation, you would be able to give the fragment an alias and then make the fragment itself optional with the question mark, which would then propagate the error there to just make the fragment null.
Correct. Yeah.
And without fragment isolation, it is a problem, but it's the same problem we have with any non-null field in the schema, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask too.
CCN's just not fixing it for you.
Yeah, the difference with fields at the schema level is like it's the server basically saying this is a state that this type cannot be in, which is it's not like fundamentally fundamentally a client can't tell a server this is a state that can never exist. Whereas a server can say via its schema, I guarantee you, client, this is a state that can never exist.
A question about how it works, though, if I'm understanding the example that I think Stephen just gave, if short name, you have a bunch of fragments that have user, and all of those users are not using short name except for one, which is using short name, and short name is a non-nullable on the schema, and you introduce short name in a fragment, it comes back null. Does it blow out user for all of the other fragments on Relay right now, or no?
Yes, and in fact, I believe that may even, unless you're using @required, that might bubble up to be a query level or response level error. Because I'm not 100% certain, but I know at least on iOS and Android, we basically treat server level errors that bubble up like this as unrecoverable.
Yeah, I think that so there's two discussions that I think get muddled because of the language that GraphQL uses. One is about null propagation, and then the other is about error handling. But because GraphQL calls null propagation error handling, like we make all this stuff in the schema nullable for error handling, then these two discussions get kind of funky. And so there's a couple of concerns. My understanding is there's a couple of concerns that Relay had. One was to do with null propagation related to fragment isolation and things bubbling to fragment boundaries. And the other was related to the thing you just said, that the clients treat server-side errors as what would you say, unrecoverable or whatever?
Yeah, basically you don't want to write anything that comes from this bad response, you don't want to write into the store.
Right. Which was my understanding. And so the other concern that Relay had was that because CCN errors are recoverable, because the client is opting into them, this sort of treatment by the current clients at Meta would cause problems. Yeah. Does that about sum it up? Is that people's understanding?
That resonates. Yeah, that feels right.
Okay. Yeah.
Would not adding a property to the error to say this was triggered by the bang be sufficient for that? So rather than the error check being, does this response have errors, The error check being, does it have any errors that do not have this new property that we introduce?
So I think one of the issues is that any error introduced by the bang is actually for relay today, until we have fragment isolation, is an unrecoverable error because you cannot write any of those values into your store. It is dangerous to write any value, any object above the, like any object that contains within it some subtree that had a bang caused error is potentially polluting your store if you write the value.
I think what Benji is saying is, and it would be a huge pain in the ass. It absolutely would be, but could there be a specific carve out for client control nullability errors where they have either some sort of stable spec compliant error message, or a field like Benji said, where we can identify these are CCN errors. If they exist in this list of errors, we don't care about them. We care about all the other errors, just not these ones.
Yeah, that would basically be the equivalent of, oh, so here's a potential option. Instead of nulling out the parent, making it unset. Because unset is different than null. When we get a null value back, we say, oh, the server said that this field like is not present on, so like the best friend is not present on this user, which is different from there is a best friend, but we can't get the name of the best friend, and therefore like we don't know how to handle that.
Unfortunately, that tries to leverage the fact that null and undefined are effectively different, which many languages don't have. We've talked about this before, where there's a marshalling issue with this, and many strongly typed servers and clients can't deal so well with that. We have, however, already dealt with this because we had this same issue with the input, where we, I don't know, in 2018 or so, I guess, maybe earlier, we made it so that you can, so that not providing one of the input values is different from providing it and setting it to null. So we do have that on the input schema, but we don't currently have it on the output schema. So it wouldn't be unheard of for us to do this, but it, I think, would have quite a high bar to have to reach. Anyway, I just noticed Young Win's got a hand up.
Just to clarify my understanding, so when the client starts using the bang for the client side nullability control, then you can kind of expect the client to, your client is opting into that behavior, so they can potentially handle, implement a new error handling logic to change their behavior when they opt into that. So doesn't that kind of solve the issue of, oh, like, if as long as we expose it somewhere as part of the response, then it should be handleable, isn't it? No.
Yeah, the question is whether we provide enough of a like mechanism to handle it that existing clients that have a store actually can use it, right? Because what we've discussed is basically, as client control nullability exists today, if there were nothing in the errors array, if there was nothing like that, Relay would be forced to just compile it all the way, always, and never ever send it to the server, because anytime a response contained a client controlled nullable like bubble, that response becomes toxic.
Are you thinking about the case where you have like the server stored like a queries and then you're using that?
It's a like Relay has a store on the client to keep all responses consistent with each other. So like if the user's name changes, we need to know that. If the user's best friend changes, or the user removed a best friend, we need to know that, and we need to update all views of that user, regardless of which query they have requested. And the issue with client control nullability specifically is when user.bestFriend is null, what does that mean?
I see. And then I guess I think the part that I'm wondering is, say, if we do expose the error on the errors array, can relay, I mean, I know it's going to be cumbersome, but can relay tell that, oh, that's why. So we just disregard, as you said, disregarding that response.
Yeah, I guess the flip side of can relay do it is it valuable enough for clients to do this versus just having a purely client-side understanding? Because relay right now does have at required, does have the ability to, on a component level, say at read time, okay, yeah, this component isn't going to be able to handle the data we have, so give it an error. And like that has value if handling client-controlled nullability is always as difficult as doing that.
I see. I remember
yeah,
us having that conversation when we first started talking about this proposal, that like, oh, can we just have the client smartly deal with it? But then I think the issue was that we have thin clients that don't have that logic built in. So if we just hit the API endpoint with curl, like how does that work?
yeah. And if we can guarantee that the error handling, or like the handling of client control nullability will work once we have client, client or fragment separation, fragment isolation, then it's probably okay to keep to get client control nullability fully into the spec. But if it still isn't going to work, even when we have fragment isolation, then the value it diminishes to the point where it's unclear whether it belongs in the spec if no client is actually going to use it.
A quick time check. We have 3 minutes left scheduled. Are there any conclusions that we want to write in our notes for today?
We're
these
going
two
to try to make a
topics are
decision on this. Go ahead.
I think these two topics are just like inextricably linked. I haven't seen any kind of path forward yet. Anthony, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say, I know that we want to vote on this and make a decision in the GraphQL working group meeting that's coming up. And this was intended to be like a, let's get, more understanding and better consensus so we can bring it to the rest of the working group. I feel like we're continuing to have the same conversations we've been having on GitHub and stuff and not really coming to a conclusion. But I really do think that the only way we can move forward is to go for not let perfect be the enemy of acceptable. And I feel like as long as we can, I agree with you, Matt, that saying relay could not use CCN is an indicator that maybe something is wrong or fishy there. But after really digging into it, I'm not as convinced. It sounds to me like relay in its current form today would not be compatible with CCN, which is an opt-in feature that, I mean, Apollo Client iOS is going to have some significant work to do to support this as well. We're going to have to do some very specific things and re-rate the generated models to have enums for individual field results, and we're going to parse the errors and tie them to fields and things. There's going to be some significant work on clients to do this. And I don't know if saying, as long as we can say those things can be resolved in the future with an RFC on better error handling and more specific field level catching, I don't see it an argument that it should continue to push us away from moving forward.
Yeah, if it's a question of getting to stage 2 versus like there's also a huge difference between like I don't know what stage we are right now. Oh, it's stage 1. Right. The difference between what's stage 2 is like yeah, the stage. So stage 1 is proposal, stage 2 is draft. Yeah, so the big issue with getting to stage 2 is going to be the consensus that this is the preferred solution.
There's you know, I have PRs open right now with implementations of some of this stuff, a version of some of this stuff, but I've been wanting to see consensus around error handling and null propagation before you merge those. So
yeah,
you need to show that you know, we're okay with where it's at, or we have an idea of where we want to be before they'll let us merge stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, for stage 2, it doesn't have to be merged, but it does seem like the questions we're still having are, you know, kind of foundational enough that we probably need to see some more resolution on these before we even move to stage 2, at least in my reading stage 2 criteria.
I agree that we don't have resolution on these things, and that does prevent us from getting to stage 2. But I also feel like the resolution should be that these are not necessarily the concern of CCN, and we should, if we want to resolve these concerns, make another RFC to resolve those concerns as an additional feature. I just feel like if we continue to try to fix these in CCN, we'll never ever get this in.
Yeah, and it does seem that quite a lot of these concerns are related to fragment isolation, which is definitely something that we should also try and address. We should make sure that whatever we do with CCN is not going to block fragment isolation. But I think we're okay on that front. I think, Matt, it would be valuable if you could dig into that a bit more and maybe write something up, write some examples up, especially if you think that it cannot address this like ever. I'd love to see the counter examples like as written code, so I can really get my head around what you're saying.
One thing we could do is strip this way back, agree to merge with like just the bang operator, making things non-nullable, and then address issues as they come up as like client authors start getting this in users' hands. A lot of the stuff we're doing right now is like trying to extrapolate off of the, you know, what Relay's doing, or these sort of imperfect allegorical examples that we have, and maybe it would be better to have something concrete.
So would an action be to prepare a scope down spec edit and GraphQL.js PR that, you know, that reflects this, and then see if that's something we can move to the next stage with?
People are into that. I'll help someone do it, but
are we settled on what, if forgetting question mark, are we settled on what exclamation mark should do? Because to me, there's still two ways that we've been discussing. One is it effectively just follows the existing pattern, and the other one is it does something different.
When I'm saying stripped all the way back, I mean like day one proposal. It just makes it non-nullable, normal propagation rules.
Cool.
I second that.
Are people into that? Is that?
I would support that, yes.
All right. Wow.
It's interesting that I think Lee was one of the people that was actually really keen on the question mark operator. I think that was, he was saying something, clarity in my memory, but I think it was something to do with, because he moved to Robinhood and they have a lot of non-nullables in their schema, and actually they need those to become nullable again because they maybe shouldn't have been non-nullable in the first place. So I think it's interesting seeing it as a mirror, but I also don't think that we absolutely need it out of the gate. So yeah, I definitely back this.
Yeah, I think your memory of that is correct.
And once we get this to stage 2 and get an implementation out there, maybe we could revisit that, interrogation in the query, but maybe even that's a simplified version that's, just the very similar behavior where it's just, flipping the nullability in the schema. But because I think getting the stage 2 wouldn't preclude us necessarily from adding a bit to the spec if we feel like there's appetite at that point.
Okay. Sweet.
I'm happy to revisit the implementation PR kind of on that work, and with your help, Alex.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good.
Or Kelvin, unless you want to do it, but since
Yeah, and
No,
Alex, there's probably a draft of spec edits that are just like an older Git version, right?
Yeah, I actually misspoke. Day 1, it was if the exclamation point field is null, then blow the whole thing out. So not day 1, but yeah, a little past that.
Just as a minor modification on that plan, I would like there to be something added to that error to say that it came from a bang.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we can definitely figure that out. I don't, is error text in the spec at all?
So the errors in the spec now, right, and this is different from the 2015 version of the GraphQL spec, but that's fine. It's long enough ago now. We have the message, the path, etc. We can add extra keys there because we added the extensions property, which is where everyone should put their own custom keys. So we effectively reserve that entire namespace, other than what's inside of extensions. So you can just add any property to an error, write that into the spec, and that is a thing that can happen there.
Okay. Okay, cool.
Okay, so the action from this really is to like day 1 spec, trim it down, find a path forward. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Who owns the agenda item on the upcoming main working group?
So
I will not be there.
That is next week, Wednesday, correct?
I think so. It'd be Thursday.
I will
wouldn't it?
certainly be there.
Are we going there with the intent of just updating of what we've done, or is it to have the pared down spec?
I don't know how free y'all are, but I think we could do the pared down spec between now and then.
Okay. Then sure, I'll take the task of getting that into the agenda for the working group.
Okay, I think it can just be discussing what the problems are that we faced, and then just saying that this is our plan. Does anyone have any major reservations, basically? We don't need an implementation by next week, though that would be nice.
Yeah, that would allow us to like get a vote perhaps on moving forward, or
All right, well, we are almost 10 minutes over time. I appreciate everyone sticking around. I certainly don't want to see this proposal die. I think this is true. Benji, is there anything to do to wrap up here, or?
Nope, that's it. Just nice to chat with you all, and see you at the next one.
Okay.
yep. Thanks
Okay.
everyone. See you Thursday, whoever is present. Bye.
Later. It's great
Thanks,
talking.
everyone.